It's been said to an entire generation of people, Vietnam isn't a country, it's a war. I'm going to summarize it for you in 7 minutes and 43 seconds. Make sure you hear the disclaimer at the end. In order to understand the war, we need to know a little bit about the history of Vietnam. It was previously under French rule and part of an area called French Indochina that included the neighboring Laos and Cambodia. One character to be familiar with is this fellow who went by many names but would become famous as Ho Chi Minh. He was a Vietnamese revolutionary that was staunchly aligned with communist ideals and also a French-trained pastry chef. Croissants, anyone? It's rumored that after World War I, Ho Chi Minh approached President Woodrow Wilson's staff with a letter regarding the dream of Vietnam free from French colonization. It's unknown if that idea ever reached Wilson's ears and will leave you wondering how different things may have been. Ho Chi Minh shortly thereafter left Vietnam for many years. During his travels, Minh studied at communist universities and worked with socialist and communist parties in both France and the Soviet Union. In World War II, Vietnam, which was still called French Indochina, was captured by the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh returned to lead the Viet Minh, which was an anti-French and anti-Japanese coalition. At the time, America and the Viet Minh shared the goal of defeating the Japanese, so the OSS, who later became the CIA, stepped in to train and assist the Viet Minh. The CIA interfering? Shocking. Upon Japan losing World War II, the Viet Minh seized their opportunity and established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in September 1945. France didn't like that, so they started the First Indochina War. Funnily enough, the captured Japanese were now training the Vietnamese to fight, while the Americans were now supporting the French. The war lasted for nearly a decade until the French eventually gave up and signed peace accords splitting Indochina into North Vietnam and South Vietnam along the 17th parallel until unifying elections could be held. Civilians were given a 300-day grace period to choose a side. The North, now led by appointed Prime Minister Ho Chi Minh, immediately began arresting dissenters and brought in radical, socialist, and communist policies that led to the death of thousands. The South, now run by appointed Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, claimed that the unifying election could not be fair as the North was totalitarian. The Vietnam-wide unifying elections would never take place. The Viet Minh supporters in the South launched an insurgency called the National Liberation Front, or NLF, more commonly known as the Viet Cong, or the VC. They would receive much aid from the North by way of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran cross-border through neighboring Laos and Cambodia, which were now independent communist states. The insurgency gradually grew into the Second Indochina War, more commonly known as the Vietnam War. America feared that a communist victory could start the dominoes falling of more communist takeovers. South Vietnam President Diem began to round up communists and arrest or execute them. He was backed by President Kennedy at the time, who did not wish to intervene directly, instead offering aid by training, advisement, and equipment.
They have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists.
Unfortunately, the Viet Cong kept racking up victories against a less competent and organized ARVN, or Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Diem's South Vietnamese government certainly didn't help tensions in the area. They were becoming more anti-Buddhist, which is a widely popular religion at the time, leading to protests and Diem declaring martial law. The iconic images of monks setting themselves ablaze in protest is from this period. The South was slowly becoming a Diem dictatorship. In 1963, there was a military coup against Diem's government where he and his brother were assassinated. I'm sure the CIA had nothing to do with this one either. What followed were at least 8 different governments in South Vietnam with coup after coup after coup. To add to the unrest was the assassination of JFK, who was replaced by a much more interventionist President Lyndon B. Johnson. A turning point in policy came in 1964 when an American warship exchanged shots with a North Vietnamese torpedo boat, killing 4 North soldiers. Critically, this engagement led the American Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed the U.S. to escalate military efforts without the formal declaration of war. Johnson had initially promised that he would not be sending troops and that the South would have to win this war on their own, but things change. The NLF attacked a U.S. airbase called Camp Holloway, which triggered a series of retaliatory airstrikes by the U.S. The South was no longer trusted to maintain security of American assets, so on March 8, 1965, the first large number of ground troops were sent, 3,500 Marines. By the end of 1965, the number of American troops had swelled up to 200,000, despite the common knowledge amongst Washington insiders that the war against the North was essentially unwinnable. For every inch of ground gained, the NLF would come in behind and take it back. Around this time, the South finally had some stability with a newly elected prime minister, but they were still not gaining any traction against the communists. Americans at home were being led to believe that the war was going swimmingly and support was still decent. This would change in 1968 with the Tet Offensive. Named after the Vietnamese New Year celebrations, the North organized to begin a new series of attacks which started during a ceasefire where soldiers were allowed to go home and celebrate. The North, during the Tet Offensive, attacked over 100 cities and towns, including the South's capital, Saigon. What the North didn't account for is that the US was now fighting their style of war. No longer able to use the jungles and terrain to their advantage, the North troops were routed in the streets and pushed back hard. It's estimated that the North lost 60% of ground forces sent on Phase 1 of the Tet Offensive. A major battle for the city of Hue was possibly the bloodiest of the entire war, but that could be a video on its own. I should mention that the following year, Ho Chi Minh, the figurehead and leader of the North, died of medical complications. Despite the North losing the Tet Offensive in numbers, it succeeded in exposing the average American to how the state of Vietnam War was really going. They saw footage of the American embassy being attacked and Viet Cong in the streets, which contradicted the official government narratives. America and the North met for peace accords, and it was agreed that the bombing by the Americans was to be halted in the North. At the time, America was having her own trouble at home with the upcoming elections, where Kennedy's brother was assassinated.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible?
And MLK was also assassinated. Nixon ultimately won, and talks of Vietnamization began as the public was becoming less and less supportive of the war. The goal was to withdraw U.S. troops and slowly replace them with trained-up ARVN troops.
After 5 years of Americans going into Vietnam, we are finally bringing American men home.
But it was pretty clear that if the South couldn't win with the support of the US, they wouldn't last long on their own. In 1972, the NLF began an Easter offensive which led to the restarting of bombing by America on the North, this time aimed at Hanoi, the North's capital. This quickly brought the North back to the table for peace talks, and in 1973, the US agreed to leave Vietnam for good. By March, the US troops were gone. Unfortunately for Vietnam, the troubles would only worsen as economic issues loomed. Promises made by Nixon to assist if needed were quickly forgotten as he was ousted over the Watergate scandal.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
In 1975, the North broke the terms of the Paris Accords and invaded in a spring offensive, attempting to unify the country before the monsoon season hit. On April 30th, 1975, the North reached Saigon and ended the Second Indochina War in victory. The country was unified as a Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and Saigon was renamed to Ho Chi Minh City after their now deceased figurehead. The unification was followed by years of economic unrest. Many didn't agree with the new government and the hardline communist economic policies. Additionally, there was so much damage done by American bombing that some areas were unfarmable due to unexploded ordnance or chemical damage. In the coming years, many fled by boat, and the term Vietnamese boat people was coined. It's estimated that almost 800,000 people attempted to flee, and approximately 200,000 to 400,000 died at sea. Those that remained had to adapt to survive the new regime. The war also left untold amounts of damage on the American soldiers that returned to a less than supportive populace and an unsupportive government who placed the political blame of the war on their shoulders. Fortunately, the message has now become,
"Thank you and welcome home."
In total, the war is estimated to have taken the lives of millions, with some estimates being as high as 3.4 million. I couldn't possibly cover all of the convoluted politics and individual efforts from the war, so I highly recommend checking out some other material on the matter. I'll link some in the description below. If you have an experience to share, please leave a comment. I read them all and would love to hear your story. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, and perhaps check out my Medal of Honor playlist for more. And of course, welcome home.